Hey everybody, I just wanted to go ahead and go over chapter 11, section 6 for those of you that want to go ahead and do it ahead of time. So in the last section, we talked about percents being greater than 100%. So in this one, we're now going to talk about kind of the opposite end where percents are less than 1%. So looking over this, one of the most important things that you need to remember is talking about place value. It's super important for the next thing that we're going to start talking about. So as a reminder, we're dealing with things that are less than 1%. So that means we're going to be talking about the decimal point and what's to the right of it. So looking at this, I have 0.348291. The 3 is in the tenths place, the 4 is in the hundredths, the 8 is the thousandths, the 2 is the 10,000ths, the 9 would be the 100,000ths, and then the 1 would actually be the millionths. We won't work with any numbers that high. We'll probably stick around 4 decimal places. Just for 6th grade for right now. There may be a couple questions that have something higher than that, just to challenge you, but for the most part, we'll stick around tenths, hundredths, thousandths, and 10,000ths. Okay, so looking at this first example, it's giving you a percent that is less than 1 because it has a decimal included in it. So I have write 0.45% as an equivalent fraction in simplest form. So the first thing that you're going to want to do, and I know it says to change it to a fraction. So why am I going to a decimal first if I need to get it to a fraction? It's a whole lot easier to change it to a decimal first and then change it into a fraction, and I'm going to explain why. So if I have 0.45%, we just talked about percents and changing them to decimals. So it's the same thing. You're just moving the decimal 2 places to the left. So with this, the decimal's already there for you. I know with what we just talked about, like if you had a plain 45 and the decimal's not there, you would assume that it's just at the end and then have to move it. But now that it's already here, I'm not adding a new decimal. I'm just using the one that I have and moving it. So I'm going to take the 0.45%. My decimal is here, and I'm going to move it 2 places, which means I now have a decimal, and then I'm going to have to add a 0. So you can see that right below this. So looking at this, and this is where place value comes in. So I have 0.0045. The 5 is in the 10,000ths place. So this is 45 10,000ths, and that's important for when you go to write your fraction. Okay. So when you're doing this, and we've talked about fractions and percents being out of 100, this kind of changes all of that a little bit. So I'm talking about 45. That's the number that I'm dealing with right here. So to make this a fraction, I'm just going to take 45, and it's in the place value of the 10,000ths. So I'm just going to put 45 over 10,000, and that is my fraction, unless you can simplify. Okay, on this, I know I can simplify. 5 can go into 45, and I know 5 can also go into 10,000. And the answer is already there for you. But as a reminder, that's how you're simplifying things. You're dividing the top and the bottom, the numerator and the denominator, by the same number to get a simplified answer. So 45 divided by 5 will give you 9. And 10,000 divided by 5 is going to give you 2,000. So your final answer would be 9 over 2,000. So your simplified answers may not look simplified a whole lot because we're still working with larger numbers. So it's okay if you get something like 41 over 10,000 and you can't simplify it. Okay. Don't worry about it being super big. Just make sure you double check that you can or you can't simplify it. If you can, simplify it. Okay, your homework is going to ask you to do so. So looking at another example that you guys will see having a fraction percent and then changing it to a decimal. So we just did a decimal to a fraction as a percent, and now we're doing a fraction as a decimal, okay? So I have 1/16%. As a reminder, when you are changing a fraction to a decimal, you actually have to divide. Please do not just put 0.116 or 0.1 or 0.16. You actually have to divide this out to find that number, okay? And remember that when you're doing this, so if I have 1/16, it's 1 divided by 16, not 16 divided by 1. You can't just flip it around, even though 16 divided by 1 is a whole lot easier to solve than 1 divided by 16. And remember, division and subtraction are the two where we can't just rearrange the problem. You have to do it as they are. Okay. So looking at this, I'm going to go ahead and start by dividing 1 by 16. So I have 1 divided by 16. I know 16 can't go into 1, so I'm going to add a decimal and a 0. 16 also can't go into 10, so I'm going to add another 0. 16 can go into 100. 6 times 16 is going to give you 96, and then I'm going to subtract and get 4. 16 can't go into 4, so I'm going to add another 0 and then bring it down. 16 can go into 40 2 times, and I'll get 32, and subtract again and get 8. Add another 0 and bring down. 16 can go into 80 exactly 5 times, and then I'm gonna subtract it and be left with 0. So at the top, your answer that you have is 625, but you need to make sure you put your decimal. So remember, when you're dividing with decimals, your decimal is just going to move straight up. So I have a decimal right here, but then that leaves me with this kind of open. You need to add a 0 right there, and you really should have done it when you were starting to divide, to say 16 can't go into 1 and putting 0, and 16 can't go into 10 and putting 0. That's why we do that. So your answer for this is 0.0625, but this is still a percentage. So this is not your final answer, because it's just asking you to write it as a decimal. So if I'm now have a decimal as a percent, it's the same thing that we just did on the last example, where I'm just moving the decimal places, the decimal point 2 places to the left. So if I have 0.0625 and I need to change that percent to a normal decimal, I'm just going to move the decimal 2 places, which means I would have to add 2 zeros. So your final answer on this would be 0.000625. So you divided to make it into a decimal, but it was still a percent, and then you needed to change that percent to a decimal. So adding the 2 zeros and moving the decimal point 2 places to the left, like we've been doing when we're making a percent into a decimal. Okay. So this one's a little bit more complicated. Just make sure you guys are dividing correctly, double check your work, make sure you're multiplying correctly to know that you're getting the correct answers, those types of things that we generally always talk about. Okay. And lastly, this was 11.6 or -6. I'm talking about percents being less than 1. This goes along with page 204 in your book. You will have questions both ways, where it will give you a decimal and you need to make it a fraction, or it will give you a fraction and you need to make it a decimal. Okay. If you guys have any questions, please let me know. I miss you guys. Hope you enjoy my koala, since you all know I love koalas. Bye, guys.